welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 57. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the best-selling author of The Rose Code and The Diamond Die, which is out tomorrow in the US and Thursday in the UK. So without further ado, hello Kate Quinn.
Hello, thank you for having me today.
Before we start on the book, can you tell us about these bachelor's and master's degrees in classical voice that are mentioned in your bio?
Yes, it's like I am the product really of what happens when, a jazz musician with classical music training marries a librarian with a history degree. So my house is full of books and music and history, and I have always had both of those things sort of warring in me as far as which one was going to win out. So I ended up going to a university for a training in classical voice. I was going to be an opera singer. But on the side, I was always writing. I was always writing novels. And eventually the novels sort of won out as far as what a career was going to be. I do think looking back, if I was going to talk to my younger self, certainly if I was going to talk to any teenager today who was considering some sort of similar path, I would have said, it's lovely that you have this idea that you're going to be an opera singer and the backup plan is that you will be a novelist. But really, maybe you should have a plan C. I am very lucky, I think, that I did not end up needing a plan C, but the novel writing did eventually win out.
And do you sing at all still?
I sing when I'm baking, I sing in the car, and I very much sing around the house, but that's pretty much all the singing I do now.
Fair enough. So if we get to the book then. The Rose Code is about the code breaking that went on at Bletchley Park during World War II. It follows three women, Osla, Mab and Beth, in work and in friendship. They are from different backgrounds. Osla is a socialite, Mab is a shop girl, and Beth is at home with her parents. And all three women come to work at Bletchley. We've two timelines. They're close together. The earlier is in the early 1940s when the code breaking is going on. And then you've got one in the later 40s in the days before the wedding of the soon-to-be Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. In the second narrative, we've got Osla, Philip's ex, engaged to an old friend. Mab's living with a family in York. Beth is in an asylum where she was taken to 3.5 years ago, and she needs to get out. She's not ill, and she knows there's a traitor on the loose. It's a really great story, really well plotted. So, Kate, you've got these three women. One's based on a real person. One is a combination of two real people, and then one's entirely fictional, though obviously still based on women at the time. How did you come to choose how you'd write the book and whose stories to tell?
It really was a question of narrowing down the options because so many fascinating women worked at Bletchley Park. The story could have been 4 times as long, and I'm entirely aware that the story is already too long as it is. It really was a question of narrowing down. And what it came down to was that I knew I would need this to be a story with multiple women as narrators because I wanted the reader to walk away from this book with an understanding of how it was exactly that intelligence, encrypted intelligence, moved into these gates of Bletchley Park and went on almost a conveyor belt to go around the various stations of the park and then come out through those gates again as decrypted intelligence. Bletchley Park itself was very much a character in my mind. And what I realized there is that because of the very strict compartmentalization of the jobs at Bletchley Park, no one woman would be able to have a bird's eye view of how the whole process worked. So therefore, I'd have to have several heroines who work at different points on that conveyor belt and who would be able to give the reader a bit more of a view of the complete picture once you put all their information together. And so that way I realized, well, I wanted to have one woman who was one of the cryptanalysts, which is sort of the glamour role of the great brains that were kicking down the door of the code to try to give the machines a chance. And that's Beth's character. And then I wanted to have one woman who worked on those very iconic code breaking machines, the bomb machines and the Type-X machines. And that is Mab. And then I wanted to have one woman who was a translator because those were the stages, and that's Osla. And her stage was really to take that decrypted intelligence and turn it from German into English. So she was really privy to these secrets before anyone else was, no matter how high they were in the government. This is why I chose the three women that I did. And this is why they have the jobs that they do, so that that fourth character, which is Bletchley Park itself, can come as fully alive as possible.
Well, I'd like to ask about Osla, if that's okay. Could you tell us more about who she was, both factually and also in the context of your novel?
Yes, Osla is the one who's based the most heavily on a real person. There was the real-time wartime girlfriend of then Prince Philip of Greece. Her name was Osla Benning, and she shares most of her biographical characteristics with my Osla. Canadian-born debutante who was a goddaughter of Lord Mountbatten, who came out in London before the war even happened. She was sent back to Montreal to sit the war out in safety, absolutely refused to do that, came back on a purloined air ticket, determined to do her bit for her adopted home country. And she first worked in a Hawker Siddeley airplane factory making airplanes. She wanted to prove that, a Deb could get her hands dirty. It was about this time that she met Philip. They hit it off, having been introduced by a mutual friend, and began dating. They were about 18 years old. He was, by this point, just a somewhat impoverished young naval midshipman, probably a bit of a chip on his shoulder and a lot to prove. At this point in the war, he was getting quite a bit of side eye from people because so much of his family, including all his sisters, were on the German side. All of his sisters married high-ranking Nazis. So he had a lot to prove as far as his loyalty went. And all he had in mind, certainly this was way before anyone thought of him as a potential royal consort, all he had in mind was doing his bit for the British Royal Navy. So the two of them dated, and Osla ended up being recruited finally for work at Bletchley Park because she had beautiful finishing school German. The two of them dated throughout the war and really had quite an important relationship, I would think. They drifted apart finally at the end. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the real Osla Benning did not end up married to Prince Philip of Greece. They did break up toward the end of the war, and that was about the time that he got to know the young Princess Elizabeth, who was out of the schoolroom at that point and had become an adult. Now, I fictionalized my Osla just a little bit. I gave her a slightly different ending, a different career post-war. Of course, I had to do a bit of fictionalizing as far as imagining what kind of conversations she and Philip would have had in their private moments, because we don't know what those things are. It's not on the record. I fictionalized her a bit with a different last name and a few different details because the real Osla Benning was a private citizen. She died in the 1970s, but she does still have living children. And since she's not a public figure like Prince Philip, I didn't want to make the differentiation that, I was not trying to say this is exactly the same person as, your mother is. I was trying to say this is a version that is very closely based on your mother, but not quite the same person.
Well, I'm going to jump. I had Philip down for later, but I think we need to bring him in now because you brought him in and there's going to be people going, my goodness, she's written about Prince Philip. It's extremely bold that you've included him, especially, given the inclusion of this relationship with Osla. I mean, I was amazed to read that the lunch that you've included with Elizabeth really happened and that you didn't make that up. It was, wow. Were you daunted at all using Philip as a character?
A bit, because mostly I felt the urge that I had to be respectful. He was very much a public figure. And so therefore, the definition of a public figure being that your life is to some degree public property. But at the same time, I did not ever think that gives one the right to, take a hatchet to someone's personality or the things that they would say or think or do. So I tried to be as respectful as possible in portraying him, reading his biographies, especially those of him as a young man, trying to stick to the things that he would have said, the things he would have been he was on the record as thinking or saying or doing. And whenever I did have to put words in his mouth, trying to do so as respectfully as possible and with the idea that this is at least something that's not out of the realm of possibility for him to have said or thought or done. I would not have dared ever make up something like this and included someone like Philip just as a whim of my own. I was just gobsmacked when, I read in the course of my research that he did date a Bletchley Park codebreaker. And I really thought that was quite a wonderful and interesting thing because he certainly had his experience before Princess Elizabeth was on the scene. And I think this relationship must have been rather important. I mean, because these were two people who meet at the height of danger and wartime when, emotions are running extremely high, when you're 18 years old and full of patriotism and passion and the desires to do right and to do great things. And they both were, I think, very swept up by that. And it seems that this relationship was important to them. It was of some years' duration. They wrote while he was underway at sea. They got together when he came back into England. And the thing I found the most telling was the fact that they remained friends after they were no longer romantically involved and after he was the consort. He ended up being the godfather to her eldest son when she married. And it was Osla's husband, actually, who said that they're always, muckraking journalists trying to sniff up some dirt about the two of them, which there was never anything to find. And he also said he was the source for that wonderful tidbit of information that around the time of the engagement being announced, it was a little bit before I had it happen in the book, someone at Buckingham Palace thought it would be a good idea for Osla and her then husband to have lunch with the princesses, with Elizabeth and Margaret. And I don't know what they thought would happen there. Like the ex-girlfriend and the current fiance were going to, exchange tips. I really have no clue why someone thought that was a good idea, but apparently someone did. And this lunch or cocktail party or dinner party, it's not entirely clear, it did happen. And I really did think that was so gloriously awkward that there was no way I couldn't include that either. I would never have made it up in a million years, but it did happen. So I felt like I couldn't not include it.
Well, I mean, obviously he's been a household name, a person effectively in my life and lots of Britain's for a very long time, a whole life. Fascinating that it's not really spoken about more, and you've brought this to light. It's really interesting. With Beth, you have the combination of a woman who was in an asylum and what seems to be Mavis Lever. Did your research process show you anything about Mavis Lever that you could tell us?
She was really a wonderful, wonderful, inspirational figure of Bletchley Park, one of the stars of it, really. She was just a teenage university student when she was recruited to Bletchley Park, and she ended up, one of the star brains for the all-female team of cryptanalysts that was put together by Dilly Knox. Mr. Knox was a classicist turned code breaker. He'd actually done code breaking work in the First World War. He was the classic absent-minded genius, and he had a habit of, among his many eccentricities, he only wanted women for his team. And, when I first read that, I cast a bit of an eyebrow at him, but it seemed that all of his ladies were very firm that he was not just going around picking the good looking ones so that he could surround himself with pretty girls to, hit on. He was very much an uncle mentor figure to them. And it seems that his motive for wanting women on his team is that he said women brought less ego to the work than men did. And so a number of women got quite an extraordinary chance to prove themselves. And one of those was Mavis, who I really found quite extraordinary. And as she wrote about the code breaking work that she did to help crack the battle plan before the Battle of Cape Matapan, which is the biggest naval victory in British history since Trafalgar. And it was her code breaking work that I used very heavily as a basis for all of Beth's breaks. The reason I didn't use Mavis for a character, although I did use not only her code breaking work, but a little bit about her private life as well, because she also, like Beth, had a code breaking romance with a Hut 6 mathematician who was loaned over to help with some of the work. And the two of them very much fell in love over the rods and cribs. And, absolutely, it was the meeting of brains in a very brainy place. And they had this great romance and got married. So I borrowed some of that for Beth's personal life as well as for her code breaking work. But in the end, since I knew I wanted to have Beth end up in an asylum, I made the decision to fictionalize her because I felt that was a bridge too far. I couldn't say that Mavis, who went on after her wartime work to be married, have children, have this whole career and become one of the people who wrote about Bletchley Park to a great degree. I was not going to say that she ended up in an asylum when in fact she did not. So I ended up fictionalizing Beth so that I could have a little bit more leeway with her post-war career. But Mavis herself was a terrifically interesting figure, and she wrote a biography of Dilly Knox, which also has a great deal about the work of his all-female team. And that book was just invaluable in the research and the writing for the Rose Code.
Well, there were so many women at Bletchley, which, you might not think of it as, first off, definitely because of the historical period and stuff and things that are talked about. We know a lot about Alan Turing, for example, and stuff like that. But I think I've heard you say before, it was a place of equality, a place that was quite diverse. Could you expand on this?
It's one of those things that a lot of the veterans of Bletchley Park, especially the women, look back really very fondly on it. And the thing is that it was a place where hierarchy meant a lot less than the work that was being done. It really became a spot where if you had a good idea, you could raise your voice and you could throw your idea out there. It didn't matter who did the work or, what their background was. What it mattered was that the work got done and got done well. So that was one of the things that I really found the most fascinating about Bletchley was that this is a place where women's voices could be heard in much more capacity than was typical for women's work during the 1940s. And, for the most part, the ladies of BP looked back really with quite a bit of affection about that. And so that's really was one of the things that I wanted to delve into as far as the environment, because Bletchley did tend to rather appall, especially military personnel who were visiting, when they were seeing these, what they thought of as these weird academics wandering around, no uniforms, no etiquette in place, a lot of first naming, no clear hierarchy or, rank structure. But the fact is that system worked very well. It pretty much was, if you can get the work done, it doesn't matter how you do it, just get it done. And with that kind of job in place, it meant that you had people who, if you had a little bit of a square peg personality, you didn't have to file yourself down to fit into a round hole.
I think this is going back to Dilly Knox. I believe there's an inspiration there from him. You've used Alice in Wonderland as a metaphor in a few ways. You've got Bletchley Park as Wonderland. The book club is called the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Beth is referred to as Miss Little, at least in the second narrative, which is, of course, a reference to the woman who Carol used as a muse. Why this book in particular? Why the metaphor?
I think it might have occurred to me at the beginning because I remember someone or other, I think it may have been Mavis Lever, described Dilly as being a bit like the White Knight from Alice in Wonderland. And I just thought that was a fun metaphor there. And I wondered if I could extend it. And it seemed like it was there. It was right there. The idea that Bletchley Park can be a wonderland, and it is. And yet there's a shadow institution to that, which is the fact that Beth finds herself in an asylum. Because even in Lewis Carroll, there's the idea that this mad world he's created does have its dark side. So Bletchley Park is a place where it is a wonderland, but at the same time, Beth then falls through down the rabbit hole, as it were, and finds herself in a horrorscape instead, which is always a little bit in the shadows of any of Alice in Wonderland's adventures. So it really sort of became just a nice, useful metaphor. And I like the idea of having a bit of a book metaphor in here, since literature and book loving was a big part of the book overall.
It's a very fun part of it, and definitely like seeing what you're going to use next, which books you're going to have them look at next, was really fun. But you've mentioned about Beth's mental state and how she is. She comes close to breakdown at times. She's incredibly focused on her work to the point of obsession, and understandably she worries what she'll do once it's all done, because Bletchley Park has become her identity really, and it's taken her from her awful family home somewhere else. Did many people at Bletchley experience mental health issues of that sort?
Actually, it was very common. It was something that people were aware that it was a tremendous mental strain. It wasn't for everybody. There were some folks who said that, I could do this all day and just be fresh at the end. It's just a matter of physical exhaustion. And Beth is a little bit like that. She can code break all day and she feels fine. But with some of the others, there could be tremendous amount of physical strain or emotional and mental strain. And that really was quite common, which was why Bletchley Park, really rather forward thinking of them at the time, they were very focused on trying to provide outlets for their people to be able to relax. There were vitamin D treatments, sun lamps, so that they could get a little bit of sun. There was tennis courts. So, you could go out and get a game of tennis in just to get your body worked up, even if you were wrestling mentally with a bunch of knots. There were all of these social clubs, not just, I invented a literary society, but there was a cinema club. There was Highland dancing that took place on the lawn. There was a chess club. There were all kinds of various outlets for code breakers to be able to blow off some steam. And I think that was because they did realize that it really was very tremendously difficult, stressful work, especially given that they were on these 24-hour shifts, which meant that you might be working all through the night or, all the way through dawn. And the fact that, if they were really committed to something, if they had a big crush on, you might work 2-3 shifts in a row. But you did have mental strain and mental exhaustion. And I remember really quite poignantly, one of the women who was a bomb machine operator saying, well, yes, it was really tremendously stressful work. And, after a while, you might start coming apart a little bit and you'd go into the medical bay. And the woman asked me, how are you? And I said, not very well. And I started to cry. And she just put me to bed for 3 days with a big jug of water next to me. And I pretty much just stared at a ceiling for 3 days and drank a lot of water and slept a lot. And by about 3 days later, I was ready to go back to work. I put myself back together. And I just thought that was tremendously moving because of how matter of fact she was. Just, oh yeah, you might just come apart for a few days, but you drink a lot of water and you sleep a lot, and then hopefully you're good to go. So I did think that was really quite representative of the fact that this work, even if it was physically safe, they're safe from being bombed, they're a long way from the front lines, but it did not mean it was without danger and stress and damage that could be wreaked on your mental and emotional state, if not your physical.
Well, what you've said, the words that she used, it sounds like it was pretty routine and people just got on with it almost, yeah.
They pretty much did.
Yeah. On Beth still, you've got this family that the dad's an enabler and her mum is just horrifically abusive. How vital was the parents' inclusion to you in terms of Beth's character development?
Well, I knew that I wanted one of my women to come from an abusive family and to be in this very battened down and wallflower sort of capacity, because that would give her the greatest emotional and personal arc. Because I wanted there to be, very much the classic wallflower to belle of the ball transformation. But it's not a man or a romance that makes Beth blossom from being someone who was always can be found like hiding behind her own hair in a corner, so she won't have to talk to strangers, and brings her out of herself into someone who is confident and intelligent and who has a job and who has people in her life who care for her. And all of these things happen not because of a romantic entanglement, but because of a job, because of work, because you have a woman here who's been told her entire life that she's stupid, that she is not good for anything except for staying home and looking after her parents, that, she's hopeless. And what she learns after she lands a job at Bletchley Park is that she's very far from stupid. In fact, she's brilliant at what she does. She has a brain that is absolutely designed to do this kind of work. And that is what enables her to bloom and finally into being an adult in her own right. And so I really did want to have her come from the most really quite repressive background so that she has the greatest things to fight against. I didn't want, however, to make it like the cliche classic of, she has a drunk father who beats his children up. That seemed a little bit like easy pickings if you're trying to go for an abusive situation and to depict one. And certainly it's very true that women can be abusers as well as men. So I had her mother be the one who was sort of like the emotionally abusive parent who keeps the children in line with well-timed guilt trips and, sort of emotional manipulation and dependency. And she fosters this. So even her adult children like Beth are quite cowed by her. But Beth is going to come into her own until the point where she will rebel against her mother. She will become an independent adult in her own right, and she is going to break free. And that was some of the stuff that was really the most satisfying to write, because I think we've all, hopefully not had a family background like hers, but we know what it's like sometimes to feel in some way constrained or battened down, even as an adult. And it can be hard to break those chains. So it's very satisfying, at least it was to me, to be able to write Beth breaking her chains and absolutely bursting free from a terrible situation into a good one, all on her own making.
Well, you said satisfying. That's the word that came to my head as well. Satisfying to the reader, definitely. So you never really use names for the men, particularly in the current day narrative, the late 40s narrative, which works really well with the mystery. As we said, you include a lot of factual information. Then there's the fiction, especially in the second half of the book, you seem to have more fiction. Why did you include this mystery that you did, this second narrative? Why return to the code breaking and the idea of traitors?
Well, for one thing, it was that when I realized that there actually had been a Soviet mole working in Bletchley Park, passing information to the Soviets who were allies at that point, that was a really big blink for me. And I just thought, well, how can I not use that? That's too good not to use. But for the other thing, too, it enabled me to have a mystery that would set up the end of the book with a little bit of more excitement. And the reason that I really wanted that for the end of the book is because if I had just simply told the wartime years at Bletchley Park, the end of the book would have been my three ladies being pulled into the office and being told, all right, your services are no longer required because we're packing up shop. Please sign here. Please never talk about your war work again. And then they would have said, yes, all right, we'll do that. And then they would have all gone home. And that would have been the end of the book. And they didn't talk about it for the next 30 years. And that is factually what happened to a great many of the code breakers. Their work wound up as the war wound up. They were told to essentially go home, don't talk about this again. And they didn't. And that's, I think, tremendously impressive, the level of secrecy that was kept after the war. But at the same time, it doesn't really make for a terribly exciting finish for the book. So I had in mind the idea that I could use the fact that there really had been at least one Soviet mole at Bletchley Park and create something of a mystery around seeing after the war, after Bletchley is totally shut up and done, that there is still someone who needs to atone for something that they have done and never been caught for. And so who better to bring someone like that to justice than people who have demonstrably proven that they can keep a secret and that they can unravel positively anything with their big, brilliant brains. And I liked the idea of using that to create some urgency, especially given that I'd also thought from the very beginning that this would be a book about a broken friendship, that from the very first pages, you can see that these three women who used to be friends now are practically dire enemies. And so that's another part of the mystery that pulls through is what is it that turns them against each other? And fundamentally, after the code breaking is done, is there a chance for them to mend fences and mend this friendship? And to enable there to be also that bit of tie up with the royals, because I decided I put everything on the day of the royal wedding of Philip and Elizabeth, because having seen royal wedding fever, even from the distance of a television, that is the very worst day of all, it would seem to me, to try to get anyone's attention, to try to say, yes, I know the wedding is on, but there's a traitor loose. Can you please help me? And the only thing anyone is going to tell you is, yes, 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 but did you see the princess's dress?
I know it's the climax bit, which is exciting. But I like how you had them going into a station and over the tannoy, they can hear the wedding bells. That was good. That was very well done, very well placed. How important or not important was it for the traitor to be easy for the reader to work out?
I am less interested in a whodunit than a whydunit. So it didn't bother me particularly if the reader figures out who the traitor is in advance. I tried to lay in red herrings, so hopefully people might not be entirely sure. But, I have some people who said, oh, I worked it out right away. And I have some readers who said to me, oh, I was totally gobsmacked when I realized who it was. So it seems to have been about evenly split. I am not the best at plotting whodunit, so I think of it less as if you worked it out or not, either way is fine. Hopefully what interests me will also interest you, which is not who did something, but why did they do it? So that's really the question that I wanted to delve into a bit more is why would someone turn against their country in this way? And my villain is fictional, but I based him very closely on the real Bletchley Park mole, John Cairncross, who was commonly referred to as the fifth of the Cambridge Five, who were the spy ring that was discovered in the 50s and 60s in the embarrassingly high levels of British intelligence. And he did have some very, very definitive motives and defenses for the things that he did, which you can take at face value or not. He was definitely an interesting man. And you can definitely read more about him if you're looking for more information on, why would someone take that step? I certainly found it fascinating myself.
Well, I had about 3 or 4 names in mind. As I was saying with how you'd approached the names of men and their inclusion or not. I have one last question on this book, if that's okay. You've an air raid happen in Coventry that becomes the second air raid that Coventry's had. The second one, the one that you write, is fiction here. In the factual history, there were warnings given by the codebreakers, but I think Churchill dealt with it differently. Can you tell us about the facts here, the warnings and the decisions made?
There's always been something of an urban legend about Bletchley Park and Coventry. The fact of the matter is that what we know is that Coventry was nearly leveled by an absolutely terrifying air raid very early in the war. And the damage was horrific. You can still see some of the damage there today. The cathedral is still roofless and bombed out, and it's been left that way as, a memorial, a tribute to that raid. And so that was a huge level of devastation. And the urban legend has always been that Bletchley Park broke the news about that the raid was imminent, but that Churchill decided not to give warning to the city because there was no way to conceal that they would have gotten that warning by breaking the Enigma code. And the most important thing at that point being that the Germans could not find out that the British, in essence, were able to crack their codes and read their mail. So the idea, the urban legend, is that Coventry was sacrificed to save the secrecy of the code. Now, I fall on the side that says I don't think that's strictly true, because the fact is that they got news of air raids all the time, coming on Birmingham, coming on Liverpool, coming on London, and they did issue warnings if they could. I fall on the side that says I think that they weren't able to break it in time, because also the thing is that Bletchley Park had whole divisions of intelligence workers whose entire job it was to create realistic ways, sort of cover stories for where did we find this information so that we can tell people we're acting on it. That was a tremendously creative part of the whole decryption process, not just decrypting the information, but finding plausible places where you could say that you'd found it, which did not involve a whole stable of code breakers in Buckinghamshire. So They could certainly have done that for Coventry as well, I think. I don't think there's any reason they would not have. So I fall on the side that says that I don't think that Coventry was a sacrifice just for the code. I think that probably it just wasn't, that particular code was not cracked in time. But I did decide to use Coventry since I knew there was going to be a critical scene during a bombing raid. I did decide to use Coventry as a tip of the hat to the fact that there is this link in popular imagination between Coventry and Bletchley Park. Only I made my version, it is a fictionalized raid, and I made my version much smaller, where someone does figure out that this raid is going to happen, and it's going to happen on a day when she has loved ones coming to the city. But it's not a national decision. Do I issue a warning or not? It's a personal decision. Do I warn my friends or not? And that is the kind of thing I thought was fascinating to delve into, because the fact is that people sometimes did find information coming across their desks. They could find personal information there. And the fact is, what do you do with that when you have sworn that you're never going to act on or breathe a word of anything you find? What do you do when suddenly you're decoding a piece of information that is vital to someone you love? So that's quite a moral dilemma. And that's ultimately what I wanted to put my ladies through. And that really does form sort of the central thing that ultimately drives a wedge between them, because I knew it would have to be something big that would break up a friendship as close as theirs. And it can't be something as simple as like, well, these three got into a cat fight over a man, or had some sort of stupid misunderstanding that could have been cleared up if anybody had been sensible about having a 10-minute conversation. It had to be something that was big.
Well, talking of your fiction and Beth, if I say the word should the reader's opinion of Beth have changed during that section, would you say?
I would like to have a situation where readers can argue either way, because I find it the most interesting when you have a sort of situation where you could argue either way for it. I think ultimately, I don't think I would have chosen what Beth did. I think I would have found a degree of flexibility that would allow a different choice to be made, and hopefully for the oath of secrecy not to be too badly violated. I do think she was in some ways wrong, but on the other hand, given the kind of person she was and the rigidity with which she approached the oaths that she took, I do find it plausible that, in her own mind, there was no other thing that she could do. So hopefully the reader will be able to, forgive her for that, because the fallout of this choice is horrendous. But on the other hand, it's nothing that she could have foreseen. She hoped that nothing bad would happen, and unfortunately something did. But ideally speaking, I would love to see at a book club, some people saying that what Beth did is unforgivable, and some people saying, no, I can understand why she did it. And there's a nice lively discussion about it, because those are the best kind of moral dilemmas to put your characters in, the kinds that also divide readers and make them argue each way.
Yeah, no, she is a very exacting character, and you've seen her grow as a character, and you're like, oh, hold on, should I reassess my thoughts and stuff? I feel we should move on to your next book. So The Diamond Eye, if you are listening to this podcast on the day of release, listeners, it is released tomorrow in the US, as said, and Thursday, the 31st of March in the UK, so later this week. And if you're listening later, the tomorrow that I'm referencing is the 29th of March. Kate, you have a reading for us from The Diamond Eye. Would you like to start with it?
All right. The Diamond Eye is a book about a real-life war heroine, a woman in the Soviet Union during the Second World War who became not just the war's most deadly female sniper, but the most effective female sniper of all time. And the thing that I loved about this particular story when I found it, and it was a very real person who I'm writing about here, is that this woman who earned the nickname of Lady Death, she was, in addition to her terrifying skills as a markswoman, she was also, before the war, a single mother, a graduate student, a library researcher. She had no ambition other than to become a historian one day and to make a life for herself and her son, but war changed her life, as war so often does. And if her wartime record wasn't enough to make her fascinating, there's the fact that this woman, whose name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, was sent to America on a goodwill tour in 1942. And while she was there, she happened to meet and indeed become friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady. And so that alone, gave me such a fascinating window into her life and made me want to write about her, because not only was she having these incredibly, violent experiences on the front line in Sevastopol and near Odessa, she was also, subject to wartime America. She came to America and she was able to see things here. She was both a Russian and an American figurehead in the end. So this is the prologue that begins her story. August 27th, 1942, Washington, D.C. He stood with a pocket full of diamonds and a heart full of death, watching a Russian sniper shake hands with the First Lady of the United States. Whoever heard of a girl sniper? The marksman heard a photographer behind him grumble, craning for a look at the young woman who had just disembarked from the embassy limousine. She'd seemed to flinch at the barrage of camera flashes like muzzle fire, averting her gaze and walking in a phalanx of Soviet minders up the steps of the White House. The photographer snorted, scoffing, "I say she's a fake." Yet we couldn't resist coming here for a look at her, thought the marksman, idly flipping his falsified press badge. A delegation from the Soviet Union arriving for the International Student Conference, that was Eleanor Roosevelt's latest goodwill project. It wouldn't have merited more than a few lines of newsprint, much less rousted a lot of hungover journalists and photographers out of their beds before dawn and sent them scurrying, pens in hand, to the White House gates, if not for that girl in her crisp olive green uniform. They say she had 75 kills on the Russian front? A Washington Post journalist wondered, rummaging his notes. I thought it was over 100. Higher, said the marksman, in the Tidewater, Virginia drawl he'd grown up with. He'd long since ironed his soft southern vowels out into a flat mid-Atlantic cadence that could belong anywhere and nowhere, but he often let Virginia creep back into his tone, depending on who he was talking to. People trusted a southern accent, and they found themselves trusting the marksman. A loose-jointed man of medium height, medium hair between brown and blonde, a bony face and mud-colored eyes, usually jingling a clutter of uncut diamonds in his trouser pocket. He didn't like banks. Anyone who hired him paid in cash, and she promptly converted to jewels. Lighter than cash, easier to hide, just like bullets. He was 38 years old and had been operating for 19 years and more than 30 marks. It had added up to a lot of diamonds and a lot of bullets. How does a girl like that kill over 100 Nazis? Columnist at his side was speculating, still watching the Russian woman on the front steps of the White House, standing to one side in a cluster of dark-suited embassy men as the First Lady welcomed the rest of the Soviet delegation. Wasn't she a librarian or a school teacher or something? Oh, Ruskies let women in their army, apparently. They're medical battalions, maybe, the marksman thought, but even the Reds don't make women into snipers. Yet he was here himself to see, wasn't he? Wanting to look at the woman whose sparse biography he'd already committed to memory. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 26 years old, fourth-year history student at the Kyiv State University, and senior research assistant at the Odessa Public Library before the war. After the war, 13 months of continuous fighting against Hitler's forces on the Russian front. Nickname, Lady Death. Damn it, how was it? Many kills was it on her tally? The Washington Post journalist was still searching his notes. Was it more than 200? 309, the marksman thought, but he didn't believe a word of it. This little junior librarian was no trained killer. She was a trick pony stuffed with Soviet propaganda, handpicked for the student delegation, and the marksman could see why. A pretty brunette with lively dark eyes and a neat photogenic face above her bemedaled uniform, nothing like the sort of mannish freak Americans would expect of a Russian female soldier. The Soviets needed American aid. They needed good press coverage on this delegation to American shores, so they had selected the most winsome candidates they could find. Front and center, this girl sniper who looked so small and appealing beside that tall, bony bitch Eleanor Roosevelt. Congratulations on your safe arrival in America. The press clustered close enough to hear the First Lady's cultured silver spoon voice easily as she addressed the Soviet delegation. On behalf of my husband, the President, welcome to the White House. He looks forward to meeting you all at a later time and invites you to spend your first days in America's capital under our roof. You are some of the first Soviet guests to be hosted in the White House, a historic moment in the friendship between our nations. She began ushering the Russians inside, and that was that. It wasn't even 6:30 yet. The skies above the Capitol barely flushed with sunlight as the pack of journalists, photographers, and one lone innocuous assassin began to disperse. Never thought I'd see the day a Russian sniper got welcomed to the White House, a grizzled columnist grumbled. FDR will rue the day. He won't be alive to do it, the marksman thought, eyes still on Mila Pavlichenko's neat dark head as she followed the First Lady toward the doors of the White House. In 9 days, the last day of the international conference, President Roosevelt will be dead. I can see the headlines now, the Washington Post reporter muttered, scribbling in his pad. Russian female sniper receives warm White House welcome. The marksman smiled, jingling his pocket full of diamonds again. 10 days from now, all the headlines would scream, Russian female sniper murders FDR.
Thank you.
No, thank you for letting me read. That was fun.
Obviously, I don't want to ask you what happens too much in America because it's going to be in your book. But how was she recruited?
She already came to the front as an accomplished markswoman. At some point when she was, a young mother, a young student, she had apparently casually went to a gun club with friends, just to do a little bit of after work shooting now and then, just as a casual hobby. She liked it enough that she decided to apply for an advanced course, which she completed. And so she already had an advanced course as a markswoman. She knew her ballistics tables. She could shoot a variety of weapons. She was already, a skilled shot. So when war broke out, she was a history student. She was working on her dissertation. She describes very vividly that she was at the beach with her friends in Odessa, in a beautiful June day. And they had gone to a cafe afterward, to have some lunch. And that's when the announcement came that Russia had been overwhelmingly invaded. And she describes how shocked she was and how she had never thought war was going to happen. But she also described how beautiful her city was and how she felt that even though she was a mother, she had to protect her homeland as a place for her son to grow up in. He was only 9 years old. He did not have a father to fight in this war for him the way that fathers do. And she just thought, well, his mother will do the fighting for him. I have to protect my home for my son. And so literally the day war broke out, she went to a recruiting office where she was initially turned down. They tried to make her into a nurse. They would not listen to the fact that she kept trying to say, no, I can already shoot. You can use me better than just to put me in a medical battalion. But she went back the next day. She found someone more sympathetic who sent her off to the front almost immediately. And that's how she found herself on the front lines. As soon as she was able to get a weapon in her hands, she started racking up her tally. And it was clearly evident that she was very gifted at what she did.
Very, very compelling. Kate, it has been wonderful having you here. It's just been wonderful reading the book and finding all the nitty-gritty of everything, the specifics of something that is generally seen more vaguely, although we know a fair amount about it. And I have to say, thank you so much for not killing off Boots. I was really worried about that dog.
Oh, I will tell you, and for anybody listening, I am very hard on the people in my books, but I never kill the dog. Not ever. So anytime you have a dog in my books, the dog is going to be fine.
I'm going to read your entire backlist now, knowing that. Yeah. Thank you very much for being here today. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Links to purchase the Rose Code and the Diamond Eye are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. And please do review the podcast if you can. Reviews are incredibly valuable, both in getting the word out there and also in terms of feedback. Reviews can be left on Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, and the Podchaser website. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 57, was recorded on the 18th of January and published on the 28th of March, 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.